these footprints. There were various theories ranging from a lunatic escaped from an asylum to a renegade Indian or something, no idea, some kind of a giant. But so he asked, it was actually that taxidermist was Bob Titmus, who plays a significant role later on. Bob instructed him in how to preserve a footprint with plaster of Paris to create a cast. And so he got the materials, went back up and made a cast, and upon returning to town, the newspaper editor got wind of it, and it was on the front page of the Humboldt Times and picked up by the AP Wire Services, and the notion of Bigfoot in the United States was born. That certainly wasn't the beginning of things. I mean, if you're aware, there was a similar kind of event that captured the public attention in Canada with the Ruby Creek incident, where a sighting was witnessed by a woman and her children, and gigantic 16-inch footprints, 16, 17-inch footprints were found in the potato field in the garden. And that was over a decade prior to this. Now, some of you probably also heard the stories that there were claims made on or upon the death of a gentleman named Ray Wallace, that the Wallace clan was responsible for all these footprints. And they produced for the press a set of carved wooden feet. They claimed they had many more. There was some kind of minor glimpses of them provided, but this is the one that was showcased. And they claimed these carved feet were responsible for the tracks at Bluff Creek, the famous Bigfoot tracks at these construction sites where their patriarch had worked, had been the foreman. Well, obviously they didn't quite have the story straight, because Jerry Crew's footprint is much larger, much broader, and obviously bears only the most superficial of resemblances. I'm even more impressed by this particular track, which was cast by one of the reporters from the Humboldt Times, and the footprint in the ground was actually photographed. There's a lot more animation in the toes. And right here, there was a good-sized stick, a short piece of litter on the ground that would have clearly high-centered a stiff wooden carved foot, leaving only impressions at the ends as it teeter-tottered over that stick, because it was not pushed down into the ground. It protruded into the casting material, suggesting a compliant sole pad on a foot. And we could talk quite a lot about this. The notion that the Wallaces, and I've actually had first-hand conversations with members of the family, Mike Wallace in particular, the son, who wasn't alive at this time, but he was acting as the spokesperson for the family. And it was clear that they didn't know what they were talking about, and their claims became more and more elaborate. And for example, the most damning fact was that he was adamant that they did not claim any responsibility for the Patterson-Gimlin film. He said, that there was talk that their dad, Ray, had maybe told Roger where to go, with very little justification for that based on his descriptions. But he said, we didn't have anything to do with it. He said, I'm sure it was a hoax, but no, we didn't have anything to do with it. Within 2 weeks, as the story started to cool a bit, they suddenly appear on camera, the entire clan, with Mrs. Wallace there in the front. She's 5'2", by the way. And they were claiming that it was their mom in the fursuit in the Patterson-Gimlin film. And she sits there with a coy little smile. Yes, yeah, that was me. So I think they were simply trying to exploit the opportunity of the situation to its fullest advantage and keep the interest going. At that time, there was a talk of a book deal, and there was for a while sort of a failed effort to create a movie about their dad's life. For me, it began in 1968. I was about 11 years old at that time, and in 5th grade, I remember distinctly seeing the advertisement in our local paper. I was living in Spokane, Washington. Roger had produced a documentary that showcased this film clip. And he was traveling around the country and showing this and trying to raise money so that he could search for Sasquatch full time. That was kind of interesting. Down in Felton, California, Mike Rugg came into possession temporarily of a copy of that documentary, and so they showed it at the last event that he held down in Felton. It was really interesting to see, to watch that film again some 40 plus years later and compare it to my recollection of the impressions that it made on me at that time. I purchased at that time a copy of Roger's book, "Do Of Almost No One in America Really Exist," and actually became a member of the Northwest Research Association, received their newsletter, and got a copy of one of the casts. And I still have, in fact, one of the perks of membership was a 11 by 14 black and white print of frame 352 and a 5 by 7 color print and a close-up of that frame. Now, to this day, in all my travels and all my speaking, I have yet to meet anyone else who was a member of that society, that association, and received those photographs. I still have the one, the 11 by 14 is up on my office wall, framed, and the 5 by 7 is in my in a protective archival jacket in my files. But anyone here happen to? No? It's the strangest thing. It really happened. I even have that original newsletter, you know, which is quite a collector's item. But I tell you, sitting there on the third row in the Spokane Coliseum with that big silver screen and this movie playing larger than life made a real impression on my mind. And you know, you can't help but watch this. This is quite an amazing little gift produced here by M.K. Davis. He has made some productive contributions to the whole event, but it's really quite astounding. I've often said that the film is kind of like the Energizer Bunny. It just keeps going and going and going, and just it seems like on a perennial basis there's an effort to throw rocks at it, to assail it with criticism, and each time that happens, it seems that enough time has elapsed that some new technology has matured or developed. And one of those was utilized, it is simply the digital age and computer technology in evaluating and manipulating digital imagery. John Green commissioned Rick Knoll to create a digital archive of the frames of the Patterson film. John had a very clean second-generation copy of the film, and Rick then photographed that digitally through a microscope at as high resolution as the grain of the film, which was very fine, actually. It was the best film that Roger could have used at that time. And even, you know, well, our megapixels, we're getting up to the point where we're now exceeding you know, emulsion films now, but for a long time, that was the way to do it. He then was able to take those images and in the computer split the color channels. Now, the reason that was an advantage was we were aware that the camera that Roger used, just an off-the-shelf, it was a rental in his case, but it was a middle-of-the-road camera with a lens of moderate quality, mediocre quality, that wasn't corrected for chromatic aberration, which means as the light with its various color wavelengths came through that lens, the different color wavelengths would be refracted differentially. So some colors would be in nice sharp focus, but others would be slightly out of focus. By splitting the channels, we could separate out that hazy, blurry image, losing a little bit of color information, but greatly enhancing the clarity of the remaining image. Here rendered in, it was actually the red channel that was in sharpest focus, and here it's rendered in grayscale, and then M.K. Davis took those images and stabilized them to remove some of the camera jitter, as you can see, and then strung them together in a GIF, which now here plays at the proper film speed. There was always some controversy about that. It's really quite settled now. You know, it was thought that, you know, if Roger was filming according to the standards for broadcast filming, you would shoot at 22 frames per second to have the best clarity. But the motion blur, the moment of the pendulum swinging that arm, and other factors suggested it was somewhere between 16 and 18 frames per second. And when you see that, you really get a better sense. You know, sometimes when you see it on television, and it's played at 22 frames per second. It looks like something from the Keystone Cops. It looks really herky-jerky and very unnatural. But when you play it at the proper film speed, you get a sense of the massiveness, you know, the time it takes for that big, heavy arm that's swinging essentially under its own weight there, back and forth. Now, this is amazing. So this is clearer probably than you have ever seen it, I can pretty much guarantee. And so comments from critics, from skeptics like David Daglin, for example, that the film is so poor, it's so blurry, you can't see facial detail. Well, baloney. That just tells me that he never worked with good quality images or copies. Rene DeHinden probably only farmed out to him a very poor VHS copy of the film. Most of the broadcast that you see, which is licensed through Mrs. Patterson, is a VHS copy of a copy of a copy. You know, it's several generations removed, and you get so much noise in a VHS copy, just a regular standard VHS. But you can see the clarity. Now, as an anatomist, I sometimes show this. In fact, in my anatomy course, after our final couple of lectures are on the lower extremity, we talk a little bit, we introduce them to the determinants of gait. What are the aspects of the anatomy of the hips and the spine and the pelvis and the knees and the ankles and so forth that contribute to the way we walk? And then I'll put this up and I'll show them. And I say, okay, now evaluate this patient. How does this patient differ from a typical human gait? And there are lots of differences. But there's also lots of anatomy. They've just completed a course in human dissection, and they've got a sense for the variation because there's about 6 or 7 bodies in the class. You know, things like if you start up at the top of the head, you know, look, you probably are familiar with the traps, the trapezius muscle. In humans, our brain is large enough, and our foramen magnum, the opening for the spinal cord, is far enough beneath the skull that, and our face small enough that our head balances quite well. If you get a little bit dozy there, like some of my students do, your eyes go shut, your head will sometimes stay perched there on top of your spine. You don't fall forward. If you were a gorilla with a jutting, heavy set of jaws and a very relatively small brain, then you need a lot of muscles in the back there to balance that head over the spine, which actually emerges further posteriorly, much back, further back on the skull. Well, you can see that the Sasquatch is somewhat intermediate. The muscles come up not to the very top of the back of the skull, but about halfway up, not well underneath. There's no rounded head there to be seen as in a human actor in a costume. And then the muscles form this large flaring cape to support those massive shoulders with arms that are just about as long as the lower extremities, producing an intramembral index that's much closer to 100, where humans are between 70 and 75. In other words, the upper limb is about 75% the length of the lower limb. And we could just go right on down, you know, talk about, you can see the shoulder blade moving under the skin. You can actually see the individual heads of the triceps, the deltoid, its definition. You can see the erector spinae muscles down the back, the prominent gluteals, the hamstrings. Watch when she steps right in here, right there behind the knee. If you reach down, you can feel that kind of guitar string tendon just on the outside edge of the knee. That's the tendon of the biceps femoris. You wouldn't see those kind of anatomical details in a padded fur costume. No way. No, you just wouldn't go to the trouble. All right, and of course, Roger's not alive to retell his story or to defend himself against the critics, but Bob Gimlin still is. And as Phil pointed out, you can't spend 5 minutes with this guy and not be impressed that he's the straightest arrow you could imagine. He seems to be without guile and just the most genuine, down-to-earth, unpresuming individual. And it's interesting, I commented that the last time I was able to spend some time with Bob, we were both speaking at that Washington State Historical Society meeting, and they put us up in the same hotel, and so we shared our breakfasts and dinners together. And in that whole weekend, not once did we talk about Bigfoot. We talked about our kids and our grandkids and what we did, and you know where he'd lived and what jobs he'd had and so on. It was just really interesting to learn more about him on a personal basis, totally unrelated to this one singular experience in his life that he kind of got pulled in to. He had no real burning motivation to study Bigfoot. It's just that he had the horse in the horse trailer, and he was friends with Roger, and they often went riding together. and Roger prevailed on him to help him out on his expedition. And more frequently, or more recently, excuse me, and hopefully more frequently, but more recently I've begun a collaboration with Bill Munns. Now you may know Bill from this famous picture, where he's standing beside his recreation of his impression of what Gigantopithecus might have looked like. You know, obviously there's a lot of speculation, a lot of artistic license, but it conveys the sense of the mass, the enormity. I mean, we know based on the limited fossils we have of jaws and teeth that this creature was at least 800 to 1,000 pounds. How tall it was depends on its limb proportions, how long its legs were to its torso, etc. In addition, Bill began his career as a makeup artist in Hollywood, monster movies and the like. But he's also a very accomplished anthropological artist and doing all sorts of reconstructions of both extinct and extant primates. As the world of imagination in Hollywood changed from the hands-on physical makeup to virtual reality, he became more and more versed with computer-generated animation, and photogrammetry is a technique for creating three-dimensional virtual worlds. And so he's been doing some really interesting research, and you may have seen or can read some of his results online as the Munns Report. Well, when I started the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, an online scholarly peer-reviewed journal, I approached him about the possibility of sort of recasting some of his reports in the format of a scientific paper and getting it prepared so we could send it out for review and get them published properly. He was very agreeable, but he felt that it was unfinished work. He said, I really need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this, but I just don't have the funding to do it, to accomplish it. So I was able to identify some funding from a private foundation that has taken some interest in my work. And so we've undertaken a joint collaborative effort. Well, this is just showing, he's extremely methodical. So he's collected all these versions of the camera model that Roger used in order to better understand any differences, any potential differences in the gating mechanism, in the framing of the film, in the film speeds that were present in these different cameras that may vary from the factory specifications. So using his photogrammetric techniques, he's created a three-dimensional model. This is actually a model that, this is an aerial photograph, but he's also created a three-dimensional model. I'm sorry, let me back up. This is not an aerial photograph. This is a photograph taken from the hillside up above the sandbar back at the time. I think this was actually taken by Bob Titmus. But just to show the fact that using photogrammetry, he's able to create, with triangulation on landmarks that are visible from varying perspectives in the film, a model of the site. We then visited the site, and he was able to resurvey the whole area and found that there was some discrepancy between his model and the actual survey. Well, and that was to be expected because we believed that the camera lens not only was not corrected for chromatic aberration, but it was a very low focal length lens. It was a panoramic lens, which would have a slight fisheye effect on the view and distort the image around its margin. The degree of distortion then correlates with the focal length. Okay? Well, that was very important to establish because if you know the height of the subject on the film itself, and you know the focal length, the actual focal length of the lens, and you know the distance to the subject, then it's just a simple proportionality to solve for x, the height of the film subject. There's been a lot of controversy about how big this creature really was, trying to use other objects in the scene, using the length of the appearance of the foot in the film, and correlating that with the tracks and so forth. This shows very clearly that the subject was about 7'3" tall. It was just over 7 feet tall. So the work with the scene itself is very important. Using his abilities with makeup artistry and so forth, and his knowledge of the materials that were and weren't available in 1967. He's done a lot of recreation of